So tonight we are here to welcome Newt Gingrich, of course, the former Speaker of the House. Yes, absolutely. The U.S.-China relationship is in the news every day, and we at the Nixon Foundation are particularly prideful about it and concerned about it. The promulgation of a healthy relationship between the United States and China is really central to our foundation's mission. President Nixon was the first U.S. president to go to China in 1972 in what is now known as the week that changed the world. That was a carefully crafted geopolitical and strategic decision to isolate the Soviet Union and help to bring about the end of the Vietnam War. Since 1972, we have experienced a different China, the rise of China, a one-party state that the United States has to contend with. In 1983, President Nixon said in an interview that China and the United States would be competitors in 50 years, and how right he was. So Speaker Gingrich has written a new, sure-to-be bestseller, Trump versus China, to pick up on where the story with President Nixon left off. This is Speaker Gingrich's 18th visit to the Nixon Library. We just calculated that number this afternoon, and it really is pretty staggering when you think about it. Of course, he is married to the U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See at the Vatican, Callista, who is a very successful author in her own right. Today, he is the founder and president of Gingrich 360, a consulting, education, and media production company. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming the former Speaker of the House, the Honorable Newt Gingrich.
Well, I hesitate to ask, other than Sandy Quinn, how many of you may have been here for all 18 performances, but it was kind of remarkable when I got here tonight and learned how often I know I come out a lot, and I've certainly enjoyed being here, but I didn't have any idea it added up quite that much. Before I get started, by the way, I do want to introduce Claire Christensen is my co-author of the new book on China, and her family is here. They're from California, and I'm very thrilled with their daughter and the work she's done. So I thought I want to talk about three things for a little bit, and then toss it open to you for questions or whatever you want to talk about. I'm going to talk briefly about the Washington Post this morning and the killing of Baghdadi. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my book on China and why I wrote it and what it means. And then I'm going to talk briefly about the folks who are currently involved in what I think is an unconstitutional and a destructive and absurd process of impeachment. And then I'm guessing by that stage I will have sent out enough different ideas that some of you will want to pursue something. We'll have Q&A. Let me start with the Post because it is so illustrative of how sick the news media is and how sick the system is, and why we needed somebody like Trump to really profoundly shake the entire system, which, by the way, automatically causes all sorts of turmoil and difficulties, because when you shake an entire system, large parts of it aren't happy. So this morning, this was the headline in the Washington Post. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, austere religious scholar at helm of Islamic State dies at 48. I'm going to read it one more time because you might not have caught fully. I mean, the level of dishonesty captured in this one headline is, I think, breathtaking, even by the standards of the New York Times and the Washington Post. One more time. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, austere religious scholar at helm of Islamic State, dies at 48. Now, this was matched, in my mind, the Post could have written, Adolf Hitler, frustrated painter. And I challenge the Post to have an outside independent audit to find out what idiot wrote this and fire them. I'm sick of being told we should tolerate people who warp things into an anti-American comment. Baghdadi, and as you know, my wife Closa is the ambassador to the Vatican. So we have met, for example, refugees who are Yazidi women who dealt with the kind of treatment that women could count on in slavery from Baghdadi, which is forcible multiple rape. We have talked to people from communities that were being massacred, Christians that were being massacred. And to call it the Islamic State is to give it a virtue it doesn't deserve. This was a group of vicious terrorists gathered together using a false religious claim. And to describe this guy as an austere religious scholar, this is a man who routinely was engaged either personally or through his assistants. This is the group which burned the Jordanian pilot alive in an iron cage so everybody in the world could see it. This is the kind of person that the Washington Post felt compelled to sanitize. Furthermore, he didn't die at 48, like, it was a bad heart attack. He'd had, last night he actually ate pork by accident and died of revulsion. He died blowing himself up and killing 3 of his children, while apparently in the last minutes of his life whimpering and crying because the Americans had forced him down a tunnel and were now releasing dogs to go after him. And so he blew himself up. I mean, had they run a headline that said, cowardly terrorist kills himself in desperate act, proving all of his promises of martyrdom to all of his supporters were lies, that might have been acceptable. If they had written a headline that said, brave American troops hunt down world's most vicious terrorist, that might have been a headline. Now, to show you what rich political fantasies I'm capable of, imagine a Washington Post headline that said, President Trump's strategy succeeds in killing terrorists. Now, I don't expect that. But I do think the Post owes the command. Post has this wonderful, their current slogan, democracy dies in darkness, which, by the way, has not led them to do a single editorial attacking Adam Schiff for conducting the entire phony impeachment in secrecy. Because apparently darkness against Trump is good, unless it's not good, in which case they'll tell us later. But the same thing here. I would argue that democracy dies in self-deception. And this is a self-deceiving headline, profoundly false and totally different from the reality of the people we're up against. So I just wanted to get that out of my system, because when I read it this morning, I was... I was so angry, I did 2 tweets and a Facebook post just to get out of my system long enough to get here so I could get out of my system again. Anyhow, enough of that. I was one of the people who believed that China was potentially evolving towards a more open democratic society. I thought it was reasonable to have them in the World Trade Organization because I thought belonging to a rules-based organization would increase their approach to the rule of law. I thought that on balance, that when the Deng Xiaoping went on the Southern Tour in 1992 and said that they had to go to a market economy, as he put it, he didn't care whether a cat was black or a cat was white, as long as it caught mice. And he really meant he didn't want to be told about ideology, he wanted to be told about what worked. And in Nanjing, I've been to Nanjing, and they have this they have a big bridge, and they have 2 30-foot tall cats, one black and one white, to commemorate this. Well, at the time, I thought this was a big first step towards opening up China, which was a complete misunderstanding. Deng Xiaoping was a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party in the early 1920s. He spent a year in Moscow at the Leninist University learning how to run an authoritarian, totalitarian, Leninist-style dictatorship. His argument was actually much more subtle. He was saying, we have to create prosperity so people will tolerate the dictatorship. And if we don't create prosperity, people will overthrow the dictatorship. So his goal in going to a market economy was to strengthen the dictatorship. Now that was the opposite of virtually everybody in the West. And Mike Pillsbury, in his terrific book, The 100-Year Marathon, says he was in the same boat. He was fluent in Mandarin. He'd actually worked with Nixon and Kissinger. He really thought this might be the beginning of a new relationship. And then he realized one day that no, the fact, what they were doing was playing us. So, very simple way to think of it is if we could simply get the news media and the administration to use the following phrase. Xi Jinping is General Secretary of the Communist Party, which has 90 million members. By contrast, Trump got 63 million votes. He is the chairman of the Military Commission, which oversees the People's Liberation Army, which is, by the way, the army of the party. It's not the army of the government. And his third job, and least important, he's president of the People's Republic of China. Now, they will always in China, in talking to foreigners, refer to him as president because they want to normalize how he feels to us. But in fact, he's a dictator exactly like Stalin, exactly like Mao, exactly like Lenin. His interest is to sustain and strengthen the Chinese Communist Party. And all of his strategies are designed that way. Now, I had 2 personal experiences that were part of my transition. The first was, we were in China, I think it may have been 2005. Anyway, Clist and I were in China. And we had with us 2 people who had been on the National Security Council. And we went to a place in downtown Beijing called the Pearl Palace. And the Pearl Palace is about an 8-story tall tourist trap. And so being tourists, we felt we had an obligation to go check it out. And we were up about the 6th floor. My 2 grandchildren were pretty young at that stage. And we were up in about the 6th floor. And they had a pajama store. And I thought, I think I'll buy pajamas for Maggie and Robert. And my 2 wise advisors, both of whom had gone to the University of Beijing, said to me, whatever price she sets, come back at 10% of it. Now, I'm an American. I go to Walmart, they give a price, I buy it, I don't buy it, but I have never once successfully negotiated at Walmart. So this is a really new and different experience, right? So I say, how much for these? She says, 200 renminbi. I follow my advisors. I say 20. They say, she will now explain to you that you are going to bankrupt the company. Her children are going to starve. and she can't believe that an American would be this cruel. She'll then give you a lower price. So she came back like at 180. They said, go up no more than 5. So I went to 25. She said, the heartlessness, the pain, the difficulties. We won't be able to eat tonight. What are we doing? How can you, the rich American, do this to me? We went back and forth for a while. Finally, I broke down. I got the 2 sets of pajamas for 50 renminbi, which on the surface was a saving of 150. My advisors were totally disgusted. They said, she made money at 30. So you just gave away 20 for nothing, because you can't. But here's what hit me. This is a civilization in which negotiating is an art form, and people enjoy the art form. Americans go into a meeting to get a deal. The Chinese go into a meeting to see what's going on, and if a deal works out, fine, but if it doesn't, they were in the meeting. So the American trade negotiator is always at a psychological disadvantage because he or she thinks they're supposed to get an agreement. And that got me really thinking about that you have a mismatch of 2 cultural styles. So then I was talking to a good friend of mine who had done a leveraged buyout of the 2nd largest battery company in the United States. Built big batteries for nuclear submarines. They were the #1 supplier to Walmart. And very early in the Chinese opening up, he had decided he wanted to build a factory in China. So he'd gone over, and the trade minister had been negotiating with him, and they would do the usual thing. He would say, this is what I'm doing, translated by a translator. Then the trade minister would think, then he would answer in Mandarin, translated back by the interpreter. And this was going on. This went on for 3 years. My good friend is from Minneapolis. So they finally get a deal. First battery factory to be built in China. And they have a big celebration dinner. And he's sitting across the table from the minister. And partway through the celebration, the minister says to him, how about them golden gophers? And he says, what? He says, I went to the University of Minnesota. I was the ball boy for the football team. He spoke totally fluent English, and for 3 years had been sitting there. Now, I suggest to you that's both a level of discipline and a level of deceit, which it's very hard for Americans to sustain longer than about 3 minutes. So now we get to the world that we're in. And one of the things I recommend to everybody to understand this is to take a look at the game of Go. Kissinger describes this in his book on China, which is actually very interesting, particularly the parts of it that are sort of a memoir of he and Nixon in China. But it's also, Kissinger is one of the most knowledgeable students of China in the United States. And he talks about the degree to which Go, which is a Japanese game but has been really absorbed in China, defines them and is very, very different from chess. And he'd gotten it from an Army lieutenant colonel who'd written a paper at the Army War College, which almost nobody has paid attention to, in which he said that this is so different that to understand what the Chinese are doing, you really need to study. So we, in developing the book, we tracked down the National Go Association, which is in Arlington, Virginia, and they came over one evening, and for beer and pizza, they spent about 3.5 hours with us, just giving us the initial basic introduction. Go is played on a very large board, and its goal is to occupy territory, not to kill your opponent. So it's not like chess where you're trying to get the king. It's a system where, first of all, you have to think about the whole board. Every move, you've got to stop and think about the whole board. Second, you've got to decide, can you gain more ground without killing your opponent, or do you have to kill your opponent? And you always go for gaining more ground. Now, if you look at Go and you think about the patience, the long-term strategies, and then you go back and you read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, written about 500 BC, and you look at the writing of the period of the Warring States, which is very different from Confucius. Sun Tzu is writing a book. It's a very small book, which is one of the differences. Confucius, I mean, he's different from Clausewitz. Clausewitz is writing a really big fat book because he's German. And he's describing the Napoleonic era. And he's writing a book based on his own experiences as a Prussian officer in the Napoleonic Wars. And it's the dominant book in Western military thinking. And it's very different. Sun Tzu was written for politicians. It's how to use admirals and generals. He starts with the following. The greatest of all generals win bloodless victories. Which is very similar to Go. If I can occupy the territory without bothering you, why would I bother you? He also emphasizes deception, spies, intelligence, bribery. If I can corrupt you and you collapse without my fighting, isn't that better than if I have to fight you? And it's really worth your looking. I mean, Sun Tzu's The Art of War is an amazing book and well worth thinking and studying about. So if you take Sun Tzu and you take Go, and then you look, for example, at the South China Sea, where they've now been engaged in a project which actually began under the Kuomintang in 1934, when they printed a map that showed this dotted line that claims Chinese territory is almost all the entire South China Sea, and basically is about 50% the size of China itself. And then it came back under the Chinese communists at 49, and what they've been doing is they said, look, we're not talking about international law of the sea, we're not talking about any of the navigation rights the West has invented, because they're all Western inventions. We're telling you, this is our territory. Now, why does this matter? First of all, 1/3 of all commercial shipping goes through the South China Sea. Second, they've gradually begun to build islands. Literally go out and just build islands. Now, they tell us, oh, these are peaceful islands. Oh, maybe we'll put an airfield on them. Maybe it'll be a port for warships. Maybe we'll eventually bring in some missiles for defense. But you know us. We're peace-loving. And so they have been slowly and steadily, inch by inch, creating a new fact on the ground. And it's a perfect example of Go. And we've been running around playing Western games, so we send ships in that go within 12 miles, which is fine in peacetime. We claim we're guaranteeing our right of transit. Well, that's true until the morning they decide that we can't do it, and they point out to us that they have enough missiles on those islands to sink every ship we've got. At that point, all this stuff's baloney. I personally believe the only strategy which makes any sense in the South China Sea is to accept their argument that you can build islands in international water and build 3 islands west of theirs between them and China in the mainland and say, we think this is terrific. And we're building them for peaceful reasons. And we're going to actually set up resorts on the islands so people can come and visit. Oh, we may have an airfield or two, maybe a submarine base, but that'll be ancillary to the main purpose, which is to create an entire chain of resorts that Chinese can come to, sunbathing, fishing. The other thing they've done in the South China Sea is they've invented a maritime fleet of fishing ships. They have something like 5 times as many fishing trawlers as you could possibly use in the South China Sea. And their purpose is, for example, the day they decide to crowd us, we're going to have an American destroyer or frigate going past those islands, and they're going to have 25 fishing ships around them. And we're going to say, oh, we're going to claim international law of the sea, right? You watch the TV footage of an American warship running down a Chinese fishing boat, filled, by the way, with children who are out for the summer learning how to fish in their own waters and being destroyed by the American imperialists. I mean, this is stuff you look at strategically and you just know it's coming. So, their second great breakthrough is the effort that they're putting in to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially infrastructure worldwide. They have 46 projects to build ports in Africa. 46. They are running ports on both the Atlantic and Pacific side of the Panama Canal. living in Rome with Callista, I watched Xi Jinping come to Rome. They signed a contract. They're now running Genoa, which is the largest port in Italy. They're running Trieste, which is the largest port in the Aegean and takes you directly into Austria and South Germany. They're already running Piraeus in Greece. If these were the Russians in the middle of the Cold War, we'd be panic-stricken. And finally, if you look at the rise of Huawei and 5G technology, this is a classic. I mean, 70 years ago, this would have been AT&T. There is no American competitor worldwide to Huawei. It is the dominant company in the world, and they are almost certainly now going to define the internet because our bureaucracies, our interest groups, have been incapable of getting their act together. I've been working on this now since January. It is the most amazing example of a free society deciding that it really just wants to go out and continue to do self-destructive things because of the particular interest of individuals. So you have an AT&T, a company which is so over-leveraged, it owes so much money, it can't afford to be competitive. And it can't think about the world. It frankly can't even think about rural America. You have a Federal Communications Commission which loves the current oligopoly run by the FCC bureaucracy. They hate the idea of a market because the market would move power away from the FCC bureaucrats to the customer. And by the way, when we did that with electricity and with natural gas, prices dropped on the average 40%. Well, if you talk to either Verizon or AT&T about a 40% decline in the price of cell phones and internet, they can't possibly pay off their debt. So they just go rigid. They hire every lobbyist they can, and they try to crowd Washington to not, and then they just plain lie. I mean, it's truly astonishing how bad it is. And I think this is, so now you have 5G with Huawei, you have the Belt and Road Initiative worldwide, you have the South China Sea, and these people are playing for real. By the way, in space, they just landed on the backside of the moon, a lander. We haven't been on the backside of the moon yet. They're just calmly and methodically doing what they're doing. So I think you'll find the book very important, very useful. I'll tell you flatly, I have an entire chapter in there on the things you can't blame China for. I mean, when you learn that there are 6 schools in Baltimore in which not a single student could pass the math or reading exam, not one. That ain't the Chinese fault. And if you think we're going to compete with China when we're producing kids who can't read and write and can't do math, it's just hopeless. So we have big internal reforms we have to make if we're going to be truly competitive. And I believe they are a greater threat than the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. And in fact, I think they're the greatest threat we've faced since the British Empire in the 1770s. So I look forward to questions and comment about that. One last topic, because I know you're going to, the first 7 questions are going to be on the impeachment. I've thought a lot about this, partially because I've presided over an impeachment. So I have some personal knowledge of just how badly Pelosi is screwing it up. Partially because I really do believe that it is, what the Democrats are doing right now is so unconstitutional and so dangerous. It's unconstitutional at 3 levels. First of all, I think it violates the Fifth Amendment's, or the Bill of Rights, I think it's the Fifth Amendment, provisions for due process. Remember, the president as an American has every right to constitutional protection as anybody else. Amen. And that is being denied him by the secrecy with which they're operating. Second, I think that it is extraordinarily dangerous because I think that when you have this kind of a system, it's essentially, the fancy term was a star chamber, which is something the British kings used where they'd pull you into a room with no legal protection, and they would rig a case against you, find you guilty, and then either take away your land, fine you, or hang you, depending on what they want to accomplish. And you had no protections. That was abolished in 1641. It's actually the basis for why the Bill of Rights guarantees you due process, because they still have a vivid memory of what it's like when the state has that kind of power. So we're watching Schiff create a star chamber. I mean, it is the most astonishing violation and move towards tyranny, in which a congressional majority says, we're going to bring you into the room. The president is not allowed to have a lawyer in the room. The Republicans are not allowed to call their own witnesses. The Republicans are not allowed to take any documents from the room, and they can only read documents with a Democratic staff member watching them. And they can't take notes. This whole thing is just rigged. But there's a third reason that it's really, really dangerous. And it made clear to me in Wisconsin on Saturday when a guy walked up to me, just an everyday guy, and he said, I am so sick of this damn impeachment process. He said, they're just sore losers. And first of all, I thought it really did capture in a common, everyday American sense. You know, you play a game, if you lose, you prepare for the next game, which will be the presidential election next year. You don't try to go back and renegotiate the game. But second, it got me to contact a bunch of pollsters that I know. Over 70% of the people who favor impeaching the president reached that conclusion the day after the election. Now, what that says is they're opposed to his being, not to his doing. Well, the impeachment procedure in the Constitution is not designed to create an artificial parliamentary system where you can have a vote of no confidence through impeachment. It's designed to find out, did you in fact at a particular time do something sufficiently bad that we should overrule the vote of the American people? And that's the whole concept. And the current Democrats are violating every one of those procedures. I think the ground they're working on may have just changed radically, because Lindsey Graham developed a resolution which Mitch McConnell co-sponsored and now has 50 Republican senators on it, which means that, and the resolution basically says, the House had better go to regular procedure if it's going to send us something. So they are setting the stage for a motion to dismiss. So you never get to a trial, you just get to, this is all a bunch of garbage done in secret by people who aren't serious, and we're not going to pay any attention to it. And that creates an opportunity, I think, for Kevin McCarthy, who I hope is going to be the next Speaker of the House, to move. I mean, we need to move a resolution in the House that says, given that the Senate has now served notice, we need to go to regular order, so whatever we do actually will be done in a way that's appropriate if we expect the Senate to look at it at all. Because if we don't do that, we've been told, in effect, they're just going to kill it. And of course, if they do go to regular order and they do bring it out in the open, it'll die of its own weight because it's an absurdity. And that's what happened to them with Mueller. That's what happened to them with every public hearing they've held. They always keep collapsing. You know, so let me say one last thing, and then I'll go to questions. But I just want to say, I think we desperately need a California renewal movement. And I don't think we need a Republican or a conservative movement. I think we need a movement of everybody who thinks that having 2.4 million people without electricity is an absurdity. That having hundreds of thousands of people living on the streets is an absurdity. That having a danger that you're going to have epidemics of tropical diseases because you can't control anything is an absurdity. And that, frankly, Sacramento is an absurdity. So.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. You have, as you said, been a long part of the library's history, and we would like to give you a gift. It's a book. It's a coffee table book titled A President Comes Home, and it's the extensive history of the Nixon Library that was produced exclusively for this event and for sale in our museum store. I encourage you all to pick up a copy, but it is a gift that we would like to give to you, sir, for coming tonight. We will get into some questions. We've got some time here. And raise your hand. I'll come to you and get as many as I can. Our first is from one of our young cadets that presented the colors tonight. Cadet Master Chief Petty Officer Benjamin Wang, who is 17 from Troy High School. Sir. What is your question?
First of all, I'd like to say it's an honor to hear Speaker Gingrich tonight. My question is, do we have a cybersecurity divide between the U.S. and China, and what can us Americans do to reduce that immediately for our safety? Is there a cybersecurity gap between U.S. and China, and how can we get rid of that immediately for our safety?
Well, I think the gap that exists is between not the Chinese people, but the Chinese system of government. And I think, frankly, as long as they follow practices like disappearing people or putting 1 million people in concentration camps, it's very difficult for us to see how we bridge that, or for that matter, stealing $500 billion a year in intellectual property. I think our argument is with the Chinese government, and I suspect if you look at Hong Kong, or if you look at the Falun Gong, or if you look at religious groups, there are a lot of Chinese who have an argument with the Chinese government, and we should be the ally of the Chinese people against the tyranny.
Next question, sir.
Mr. Speaker, my understanding is that Congress is limited in what it can demand from a co-equal branch of government from the executive branch. Now that Congress, the Speaker, Pelosi, has declared that there's an impeachment proceeding going on without a vote, does that pose a danger to separation of powers among co-equal branches?
Well, the problem with what Pelosi has done is that she isn't the Congress. I mean, she isn't even the House. She's the Speaker, but the House has to speak. And the only way the House can speak is by voting. So, in my judgment, as a former Speaker of the House, this is a totally illegitimate activity, and that should have no bearing and no standing, because they have never taken a vote, they've never established rules of proceeding, and what you have is a bunch of political hacks, starting with Pelosi and Schiff, who are, as I said earlier, living out a sore loser's fantasy. They're already, in a sense, conceding psychologically that Trump's going to get a second term. And so they're desperately trying to find a way to get rid of him before he gets a second term. And I think all they're doing, frankly, is setting the stage for a catastrophic defeat for the Democrats next year, because the country's not going to be open.
Mr. Speaker, to your right, sir.
Hi, hello. I heard a Democratic congressman on the news saying that a president can be impeached for any reason. They can even impeach him for wearing a tan suit. Please comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I think as a practical matter, impeachment, remember, the House impeaches, which is the equivalent of a grand jury finding. The Senate then becomes a jury presided over by the Chief Justice, and the Senate then has to judge the trial, in effect, as set up by the House. So, in theory, the House could decide that they don't like orange hair, and that therefore they're going to impeach the president for having the wrong hair, in theory. However, that would both totally put the House in disrepute and guarantee that the Senate would just move to dismiss immediately. So part of their challenge is you have to, remember, impeachment is saying to the American people, this person did something so bad that we are repudiating your votes. So 63 million people picked Trump. Under our electoral process, he won. In fact, won in the Electoral College by a big margin. And so they're now saying that they're going to reverse this. And in order to make that stick, you had better find something big enough It can't just be, oh yeah, on a technicality. Remember, when we impeached Bill Clinton, we had an independent counsel report from Ken Starr that included 11 counts on which he said he was guilty. He uses the word guilty 11 times, one of which is perjury, which is a felony. And so we were faced with, I mean, how do you not investigate an allegation that the President of the United States is guilty on 11 counts? When Mueller came in and had 0 guilty, I thought, frankly, that was the end of it. And this is, to me, suicidal. I mean, for the Democrats to, and I said the other day, Pelosi can probably coerce enough Democrats to pass an impeachment resolution, but it will be an act of suicide. I mean, the people she's coercing at the margins are all going to get beat, I think.
Next question, sir.
Yes, sir. Mr. Speaker, my name is Ray White from Anaheim. I really don't believe that Pelosi and her bunch really want to have a vote for a while. I think they're going to try to drag this thing out till the middle of next summer, or maybe closer and closer to the election time, to keep it in the news, to keep people talking about it. And that's just my opinion. Now, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's certainly plausible, both because I'm not sure they can win a vote. I mean, there are apparently a pretty substantial number of Democrats, like Congressman Peterson in northern Minnesota, who's in a district that has a 30-point Trump advantage. Well, voting to impeach Trump in that district is tantamount to voting to go home. You know, so he's trying to figure out a way to not have the vote. On the other hand, this thing rapidly, and we had this happen to us to some extent, the American public's willingness to tolerate a particular behavior is fairly limited. And presently, in fact, the strongest polling numbers I've seen recently are to the question, you know, are the Democrats failing to solve health care because they're so fixated on investigations? And if they end up becoming the do-nothing Congress that investigates but doesn't solve anything, that begins to be a huge burden for them. And I think that may start happening by sometime this fall, just because people get tired of it. I mean, people have a very low tolerance for repetitive stories for Schiff making up the next allegation that will disappear once adults look at it.
Section to your left towards the back, sir.
Mr. Speaker, has the President considered seeking an injunction in federal court to put a stop to these unconstitutional proceedings?
Yeah, I don't think it would work. The court would argue correctly that the House is the master of its own rules, and it's not going to intervene, I don't think, against the court. And look, again, impeachment is, in the end, an inherently political process. I mean, the Founding Fathers all knew that. That is, ultimately, it has to reflect the will of the American people, not the will of a bunch of judges. And if you have 3 co-equal branches, the President has the ability to defend himself, the Congress has the ability to investigate him if they think he's done something really wrong, and it balances out. And I think in this particular case, I think that it will disintegrate just because week after week, everything they touch turns out not to be true. And I think there's a point after a while where people just are going to shrug off. And I think the whole notion that this is essentially a really sick game played by sore losers devalues people like Schiff of any plausible moral stake. I mean, these are not people who have moral authority. These are people who are just politicians who are mad because their side lost.
Very back to your right, sir.
Mr. Speaker, it's an honor. I wanted to ask you, do you think that the Ukraine debacle that they're coming up with on the left is indicative of a smokescreen because of what's coming out with the Horowitz report, because of what's coming out with Barr and all the investigations? I know we don't know until we know, but Durham seems to be pretty proactive. Just wanted to know your thoughts.
I'm not quite sure I understood this. You went to like 3 different...
My main point is, what do you think the outcome? I know we don't know what's going to come out of Barr and Durham's investigations, but how do you think that what's coming is going to play into the smokescreen of the Ukraine whistleblower? Do you think that's a smokescreen?
Okay, yeah, let me divide those two. First of all, there is no whistleblower. Okay, this is just baloney. What you had And I think this is an example like the Washington Post headline of how the left manipulates everything. What you had was a disgruntled federal employee who's a liberal, who apparently used to work for Joe Biden in the White House, who pulled together a bunch of allegations, many of which are factually false. We now know they're just factually false. So he's a leaker. He's not a whistleblower. Let's start there. And you'll notice, by the way, the Democrats now are saying they might not even call him up. So this whole thing was started by a guy who's a liar, who they were so excited. This is exactly what happened with Kavanaugh. Remember? Kavanaugh was going to be gone because after all these horrible things happened, and oh, well, maybe they weren't horrible, or maybe they didn't happen, but they might have happened. And if they didn't happen, they should have happened. And we feel really bad. And now he's a Supreme Court justice. And it just goes to show you that if you're a liberal, there's no hope left.
Our next question.
Why is it so difficult, Speaker Gingrich, for Republicans to band together as the Democrats band together? Because it is so disheartening to constantly see other Republicans fighting against when together their strength, and they keep weakening themselves. I mean, and this is not something new. It's years and years of this, and I personally have never understood that.
Well, let me draw a distinction. I mean, you just saw Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell pull together a resolution which is devastating to the left, and they now have 50 out of the 53 Republican senators have signed it, and they may get the other 3 by the time it's done. That's kind of pulling together, frankly. So I don't know that that's the case. There's a different thing here, and I want to be fair about this. There are some people. John Kasich's a good example. Kasich was a good friend of mine, and he's clearly gone sour. Okay. To some extent, I think it's why Paul Ryan retired. There are people who represent an older, different Republican Party. Trump, remember, I mean, let's be fair. Trump was a hostile takeover. I mean, you know, when Trump announced, I think for the first entire section of his campaign, he did not have a single congressman endorse him. You know, and when he first announced, people thought this is weird. And then when he began winning debates, they thought it was weirder. So if you were a normal, traditional Republican, whether it's in style or it's in policy, Trump has been very hard to come to grips with. And I think that's legitimate. When you get somebody like an Andrew Jackson, who is as disruptive as Trump is, then you're going to have sort of the pieces of the old order that are sitting around being unhappy. And I don't blame them for being unhappy. They're getting run over. But they're also less and less important every month. But one other example, by the way. Mitch McConnell, who's done an extraordinary job of getting judges approved. I mean, the historically best performance ever by a Senate Majority Leader in getting judges approved. Well, that took a very unified Republican Senate to get that done.
Mr. Speaker, we have time for one last question. That question will come from our vocalist tonight, Mr. Gerald Colucci. Gerald, thank you for your rendition of the national anthem. What is your question?
I'm very concerned about voter fraud. I got an email from a friend of mine yesterday, and he said, I can't believe it. My parents voted Democrat in Florida in the last election. He goes, I know they would have never done that if they were still alive. So I'm very concerned about voter fraud.
Well, first of all, if your friend really meant it, it would be useful to have that information. Okay? I mean, that's part of the problem. I think voter fraud's a very real problem. I think the Democratic Party relies very heavily on voter fraud. And I think that if you actually had a completely honest election, the Democrats would find a number of seats that are Republican that they were confident they were going to hold. And I think if you look at the results in the last California election, the whole way in which the Democrats ran that was, I think, conditioned on the idea that they could steal enough votes. So and Georgia had a long tradition. It's the Atlanta Journal won a Pulitzer Prize for investigating the election of 1948, in which Herman Talmadge ended up winning the the primary. His dad had actually died during the primary. Herman ended up winning, and one of the keys to his winning was the votes cast in his home county. And they went down and they literally checked vote by vote. And for example, there was a lady who was in Macon who had not traveled the 140 miles back home to vote. And they asked the people in the registrar's office, and they said, well, you know, we knew how she would vote. And we didn't want to inconvenience her by making her come back, so we voted for her. Okay, this is a long tradition. Thank you all very, very much.
Mr. Speaker, thank you.